Thanks for staying with us. Now, do you trust your member of parliament? You may have even voted for this person, but do you really believe that he or she can deliver on his or her promises? Well, the most recent Afrobarometer report indicates that 73% of women in Ghana do not trust Parliament. Perhaps this is the reason why 96% of them have not contacted their local government councillor. So what is the real reason for this low figure when it comes to civic engagement and trust in our institutions? Dr. John Osai Kwapon, who is with the Center for Democratic Development's national partner of Afrobarometer, will be addressing these issues and more at a forum today dubbed Fourth Republic, Women's Perspective Through the Eyes of the Afrobarometer at the CDD Ghana premises here in Accra. Now, he has joined us this afternoon to help us understand these issues further. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So this evening you will be speaking for a couple of hours at the CDD Ghana headquarters, but help us to understand what are the highlights of what we should expect from this presentation.
So essentially I will be looking at how female respondents have answered certain key questions around democracy and governance, civic engagement and participation, as well as institutions and trust in leaders. And since I'm doing this event in collaboration with the Pepperdam Ministries, which is a gender-based advocacy group, that's the approach to it. The three key highlights which I would expand on based on 6 rounds of the survey. So the survey, real quick, has been administered in 1999, 2002, 2005, 2008, 2012, and 2015. And so the key points that I will be raising will be centered around what I am picking up as a gender gap in civic engagement and participation. So around questions such as, how often do you discuss politics, your interest in public affairs, how often do you contact certain key leaders in our democratic institutions?
Like we just saw,
like we just saw,
96% are not doing that.
Yes, and then the other key highlight that I will be expanding on is what I'm also seeing is the changing attitudes towards political parties. So there's a question in there that asks, political parties are divisive, we need less, and then there's another statement that says we need more political parties so that voters can get more genuine choices. There's a very interesting dynamic going on if you look at the trend from 2008 to the last round of the Afrobarometer survey. And then the last thing that I would highlight is what I'm calling the approach to collective action. And so there's a question in there that talks about if you have contacted any of these leaders in the past 12 months, did you do it alone or did you do it in a group? And it's very interesting, the signal coming out in terms of how female respondents answered that question in 2008 compared to how they answered that question in 2015.
So let's look at what we are learning from these trends. For instance, we know that for the question, how often do you discuss politics? Yes. We know that 23.4% females answered yes, they discuss politics quite often. And in 2015, it was 20.6%. So it is going down. But compared to men, which interests me a bit, you find that in 2015, men answered 35.0% of them. So what are we learning from these trends that we are picking?
So if from the trends in what I've put together, you would really notice some differences in how female respondents are expressing or sharing their experiences in the public space compared to male respondents, right? So that if you construct a narrative out of it, there are certain places where there's convergence. You know, the views expressed by female respondents is no different from the views expressed by male respondents, and it also mirrors, if we put it all together as all citizens, the view seems to be the same. But there are also key areas where you do see certain differences among the genders. And so the point that I am trying to raise to the Pepperdam Ministries as an advocacy group is to say, what do these things mean for you? What are the implications of some of the similarities, but most importantly, some of the differences we also see for gender advocacy work?
Now, there are some issues which come up with men and women when it comes to politics and civic engagement, that there is much of a difference if you look at the number of females in parliament, for instance, the number is so small compared to the men. Where do you think the main reason is, and how do we start dealing with it?
And that's also the question that I'm hoping we would engage in with the audience and those who would participate today between the hours of 5 and 7 at CDD. Because I always say that survey results gives us signals. It gives us something to think about. So it demonstrates the what. Now our job now is to answer the why. And the why could be, there could be structural reasons, there could be cultural reasons, there could be a whole host of reasons that explains why we see the differences in how males and females are responding to some of these important questions on democracy and good governance. And
you think the patriarchal setup of our society has anything to do with it? How women generally complain that society seems to favor men more than women. You think it has something to do with it? I'm
sure that there is definitely some component of it that could be explained by the way society is structured. But again, as a social science researcher, I always say that no single variable explains any phenomenon that we see. And so my encouragement and my job is to open it up to dialogue for us to begin to tease out all of the explanatory variables that helps us understand why we're seeing the kind of phenomenon that we see when we look at males and females in how they are answering questions about democracy and governance in Ghana since the inception of the Fourth Republic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
For your time. Doc will be, like we've been saying, at the CDD Ghana headquarters today, and he will be explaining all of these issues if you want any more details about it. So we'll be moving on now in just a moment. You're still watching Joy News Today with myself, Daniel Dazi. Now, let's speak about a woman now. She got justice after her father was jailed for defiling her at age 13. Lack of social protection has pushed her onto the streets and opened her up to all manner of social vices, including prostitution. That's the story of a 20-year-old victim of incest who lives a solitary life with her 2 children and is pregnant again. Love FM's Kwesi Deborah reports.
Amma, as we call her in this report, tells me she used to sing in church. She is full of praise to God, but maybe not out of gratitude.
I was raised by my grandmother at Pushing, a suburb of Kumasi. I decided to look after my biological father, who abandoned me after birth. So I moved to stay with my dad after a family member agreed.
On the night of May 2011, the unthinkable happened. Her father, Joe Louis, possibly has sex with her in the apartment.
Relatives who heard my screams reported the matter to the Swami police, who arraigned my father before the law. At the court, my father pleaded guilty to the offense and pleaded for forgiveness. He told the court he doesn't know why he committed that offense.
Amma returned to her grandmother, who is now 85 years. She couldn't contain what she considered an unpleasant state of being a burden on the old lady, so she decided to search for work. Life led her to a group of gangsters where she took to smoking marijuana and engaged in sex trade for survival.
5 months. Out of sex trade, I've gotten 2 children and I'm now pregnant. I am tempted to go back to the house of my grandmother, but it isn't working. They have refused me home on grounds that I come without the pregnancy.
Amma now lives in a kiosk. She has few clothes in this polythene bag. Lydia is her benefactor.
She came and told me she has no place to sleep. She was with me in the house and my husband had traveled. When he came back, I moved her into this place. I was moved by her pregnancy.
She wants a reformed life, but she has no idea how.
Now, Joy News is spearheading an online campaign known as #JusticeForKids, where justice is being sought for victims of defilement, like the one we just saw. Now, the campaign has, among other things, sparked a national debate, resulting in sweeping reforms from the Gender Ministry. Recently, discussions began around amending the Children's Act to protect such victims further. Now, we've been joined in the studio by Hilda Mensah, Child Protection Specialist in charge of Justice for Children with UNICEF. She has been working with ministry officials in these efforts. Welcome, Hilda.
Thank you very much.
So tell us about some of these efforts you've been making to reform our legislation and generally make our nation safer for children.
I think that as a child protection program in UNICEF, our core objective is to support government to build their capacity, strengthen the system to reduce violence, abuse and exploitation of all forms against children. And the approach we are looking at using, one of it is legislative reform process, strengthening the regulatory framework that protects children and prevents violence against them. And so on Tuesday, when we had a national consultative meeting on the review of Children's Act, Juvenile Justice Act, and related laws. That is one of the initiatives aimed at strengthening the environment for children. There are others, of course, and I'll talk about that later. The Child Protection Program supported the government and the Ministry of Gender, like you rightly said, to develop two policies, a child and family welfare policy and a justice for children policy. And these were informed by earlier research we undertook in 2010 that revealed that children in Ghana still face a lot of violence, abuse and exploitation, potential of being trafficked, potential of being trafficked into prostitution, neglect, non-maintenance, all of those host of issues were revealed in the research. And so that's strengthened our position to say that, look, we need a national framework for protecting children that provides clear guidance on how children should be handled in terms of preventing such abuses and also responding to them in a way which is efficient, sustainable, and relevant within the context of our society. And so, having developed those two policies, and fortunately they were approved by Cabinet and duly launched.
Of course. And
then what it means is that we needed to look at the laws that relate to children and ensure that the aspirations of the policy reflect in the laws. And so, when we embark on the legislative reform process, it's the second leg after the policy development process to ensure that
that's great. I remember listening to the gender minister, Otiko Afisa-Jaba, saying that picking cues from some of the reports she has been hearing, there would be a need to change some of the things in the legislation, as you have mentioned, in light still of the development of these policies. So on Tuesday, what are some of the major changes that you'd like to share with us?
One of the key gaps that are currently in our law has to do with victim protection. You know, there isn't adequate legislation, I would say, maybe limited, that protects the rights of the victim. You know, and when you talk about the perpetrator, he's the one who has the right to remain silent and to proven guilty. You know, he has the right to a lawyer, etc. That doesn't say that the victim doesn't have a right to a lawyer, but perpetrators have legal aid, for instance, you understand. But currently, as it stands, when a child is defiled, the child doesn't have to pay for medical bills. And remember that it's children who are from the poorest family who are most likely to be violated in that manner. And so for medical bills also to be demanded of the family is a bit too much. And what happens is that once the child is not able to provide, or the family is not able to provide the medical report, it's likely to delay the legal process. It discourages even the victim from going to court on, and eventually they back out. So in the end, justice is not served to the victim, right? Now, currently, as it stands also, there is nothing that says that a child is entitled to psychosocial support. And even if the child were to have that, it isn't adequate in the system as we run now. So we have social welfare, officers who do their best to provide better services for children. We have the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit. All of them need to have the capacity to be able to provide the required support to a victim. Now, if a victim is even supposed to get compensation at all, it's usually left to the discretion of the judge. There's no explicit provision in any law that demands that the victim is entitled to compensation. And so the alternative is that if the judge fails to provide that, the victim can take a civil action. But how many, again, people can afford?
Will take that initiative.
Initiative to demand that kind of compensation. So a lot needs to happen.
It's being suggested that a fixed compensation for the victims is introduced,
among other things, such as the psychosocial support,
payment for medical
support,
bills,
which is paying for medical bills. Maybe the state will have to absorb that.
Do these medical bills include the test for if the victim has been raped or has been defiled?
I guess so, because it's the whole gamut of the medical care, the testing, the medical care, etc.
Right. So
is the child who best?
We are looking at it in entirety. I'm curious about this issue of compensation, because what we find is that a lot of the perpetrators come to the victims and say, take this amount of money, let's settle it out of court, let's settle it at home, as Ghanaians like to refer to it as. Now, Justice Ofaya Adinyira mentioned at this forum that it would be necessary to raise this crime to first-degree felony, because where it is now, the Court Act actually encourages that crimes like that are settled out of court, reflecting in some of the statistics we are seeing when it comes to cases that are not resolved. Tell us a bit about the raising of defilement to first-degree felony.
I think the point that she made is very clear, and maybe you might want to speak to the legalese for the detailed implications or the repercussions of that. But it's in a good cause, because what she said was that the way that is crafted now has the potential to allow out-of-court settlement, which does not inure to the benefits of the child. Remember the medical attention that the child receives. Remember the psychosocial support that the child receives, the trauma, all of that. If you went to settle this out of court, how does the child get justice? How does the child get care? There are instances where children have had to go through surgery because of that act of defilement. How do you repair that? And how are those children also reintegrated back to their family? And so that's why it's important to look at it in totality. And so for our program, for instance, that's why we are not looking at only the laws, reforming the law. But a few other things need to go hand in hand. In particular, you need to strengthen all the relevant institutions to have the requisite capacity to be able to provide services in preventing and responding to child abuses.
What about the issues of age of consent for sexual relations?
The age of consent, people are advocating that the current age of consent for sexual consent is 16, while the age of marriage is 18. There are some people who are advocating that children are engaging in sexual behaviors because of that consent which is in the law.
Yeah, so it should be
pushed to 18. But that has repercussions. And so as part of the process, we are going to be having people who have position papers and then expose us to the pros and cons of having to raise that age, what that means. Let's reach a consensus before we make a proposed amendment to court. So that's what it is. But maybe let me just quickly add that, violence and sexual violence of any form is unacceptable. It's a gross violation of children's rights. It doesn't mean anything for us to amend the laws or build the capacity of institutions if the individual, the family, and the community attitudes do not change. And so our third component of approaching this is to ensure that there's a huge social drive, which is going to be launched soon, that's, as it were, calls on all of us to take action to frown on any kind of violence against children. And we need that. So if attitudes don't change, we won't do much with laws. You understand? And across all levels, both the formal and informal, we need to change attitude as individuals, as families, as communities, and we need to have that collective responsibility to ensure that we are protecting all our children.
Right. Thank you very much, Hilda Mensah, for your time here. Now, moving on, residents of Wamase near Kwadaso in Kumasi are terrified by the drowning of a man in a well. Mother of the deceased, Mary Cramo, says her son complained of fever after breakfast and decided to seek comfort in the well. She says attempts to restrain him fell on deaf ears. Love FM's Kwesi Deborah reports.
It's been 30 minutes. Residents are trying all they can to empty this well. Ibrahim Seidu, believed to be mentally unstable, lies at the bottom. The water subsides and finally his head is visible. Ibrahim Seidu, believed to be in his late 40s, reportedly jumped into the well for a cool-off in the water for relief from the scorching sun. Mary, sick and weak, helplessly looked on whilst the son drowns. Mary therefore informed residents, who came around to get the body out. An hour has passed, and finally the body is out.
I'm sick and I've been idle all day. After breakfast, he told me he's feeling hot, so he told me he's entering the well. I found nobody around.
The police were yet to arrive at the scene by the time Joy News left. Reporting for Joy News, Kwesi Deborah.
Now, everyone hopes for a healthy life, but not everyone is lucky to have it, and that includes some persons living with disability who are often confronted with the complications of their disabilities as well as social stigma. But one organization is making sure some persons living with disability are able to overcome their deformities and eliminates the social stigma that comes with it. Beryl Richter has more in this report.
For more than 10 years, 30-year-old Samuel Oforibuafo has battled with clubfoot and polio. The situation left him dejected as he was abandoned by his friends and was forced to drop out of school.
Life is better now. At first, I was always left at home, but for the intervention of the Salvation Army, I don't know what would have become of me. I couldn't play and mingle with friends.
Samuel called the Salvation Army Rehabilitation Center at Pegro in the Eastern Region home for many years as doctors there treated him. One of the officers at the facility, Eric Entry, recalls when Samuel was first handed to doctors for treatment.
Oforibuafo came to Salvation Army at the infancy age with a diagnosis of clubfoot and polio. And through the Salvation Army, we did the therapy sessions and he was able to walk a bit, but it was not all that good. And he went back and came with a lot of financial issues, which they were not able to get access to money to contribute to the surgery. Through the Salvation Army, they did a surgery on the leg.
After years of treatment, Samuel is back on his feet and looks forward to excelling in his carpentry business.
I don't have any help. I am therefore appealing for support to set up my own carpentry workshop.
Samuel's story is similar to many more at the facility. 8-year-old Adoma Boatin is battling with cerebral palsy. Her grandmother, Agnes Aku, narrates the challenges she has to put up with daily. She is unable to do anything on her own. The best she can do when she falls down is to sit. She can't hold things. She is also unable to eat unless I feed her. Over the years, Salvation Army Community Rehabilitation Center has provided outpatient services to children and adults living with disability in the district and other communities. The center, which was established over 35 years ago, also has an on-site integrated school for children with disability in the district. Managers rely on support from Salvation Army International and the benevolence of other donors to keep the center running. That is why the support of one such donor, Lena Clark Foundation, comes in handy. Pamela Odre, a representative of the foundation, says the organization is optimistic of making bigger donations to the facility in the future. On such occasions, no one is happier than the children here at the center.
We are presenting all these things to these lovely kids. We hope that next time we'll come again to make it bigger and better.
We want to say a very big thanks to you. We are very grateful for all you have done for us, and we wish you will come back and give us more than what you have given us, and God bless you.
Many people living with disabilities in Ghana are often resigned to a life of stigma. But clearly, in the Begro community in the Eastern region, the social stigma attached to disability is virtually non-existent thanks to the intervention of Salvation Army Community Rehabilitation Center. For Joy News, Beryl Richter.
Now, players in the housing industry are optimistic effective collaboration between government and the private sector can potentially address Ghana's housing needs. The country's growing housing deficit currently stands at 1.7 million units. This and other challenges are what Multi-TV's annual Habitat Fair seeks to address. Prince Appiah has been monitoring preparations ahead of Friday's opening of the Kumasi edition of the event over 3 days.
Goal 11 of the Sustainable Development Goals demands signatories ensure inclusive human settlement and management. This, however, seems far from being achieved, as observed by Dr. Divine Ahaji of Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. The lecturer at the College of Settlement Planning is worried Ghana's pace towards inclusive society is too slow.
I don't think Ghana is prepared now to use cities or housing as a means of addressing Goal 11, especially building an inclusive society. Because over the years, government policy towards housing has focused on building houses for government workers who form just how many people are in the public sector as compared to those who are in the informal sector. It means that in terms of housing, government is doing very little to help the majority of Ghanaians who are poor and I think that is where I think that if SDG 11 is saying we should use housing to build an inclusive society, I think Ghana is failing as a country in that direction.
Sami Amegaibo is secretary of the Executive Council of Ghana Real Estate Developers Association, GRIDA. He believes there is no effective collaboration between private sector and government.
Infrastructure, provisions, road, electricity, water, and those stuff which also add up the cost to the developer are things that are actually the responsibility of government. But government today says that it doesn't have the funding, or there are so many things that they are looking at, so don't have the big budget to support it. And so developers are doing it on their own. And so these things can be done. We need to collaborate between government, the central government, the district assemblies to be able to.
Against this background, the annual Multi-TV Habitat Fair opens in Kumasi after successful events in Accra earlier. Feverish preparation is ongoing at the Kumasi City Mall, venue for the 3-day fair. Stephen Eswon leads the operations team.
Habitat Fair remains the best in the housing industry. Like I said earlier, it brings together everyone, those in the real estate development, construction, home furnishing. We have other clients that are also into solar, especially when you have power challenges. We have Energy Commission to be part of this fair.
Some exhibitors have high expectations.
We are here in Kumasi expecting a big turnout, but we must all come here and see the kind of properties that we have. They are properties that surpasses anything in this country for now. Their prices are very, very good, competitive, and the environment is as clean and serene as possible.
Preparation is ongoing, and we are expecting the people of Kumasi to come to the mall and see what we have to showcase. Everyone should come out, come to our stand at Elegant Homes, see our beautiful houses. We're giving out 10% discount on all our properties, in addition to a video entry system, remote control gate and garage, fitted kitchen, and many more. See you there.
Sapia reporting.
Habitat Fair continues over the weekend. Now, over 400 traders at Abofor Market in the Ofenso municipality of the Ashanti region hit the street Wednesday to protest moves by the Municipal Assembly to relocate them. Businesses came to a standstill as the traders vowed to resist attempts to move them to new market they say is uncompleted. Love FM's Nana Asensu Mensah reports.
Some of the traders told Joy News facilities at the site are inadequate and inappropriate for occupation. They accuse MC of unlawfully seeking to eject them from their present location.
When you take a good look at the market, you will see that it is not fenced. The environment is filled with filth and poor drainage system, which is not conducive for our health. We are pleading on the government to come to the aid of the people so we can continue with business.
Assembly officials, however, explained the relocation is to end buying and selling along the road, which exposes people to danger. Spokesperson Joe Dufour says the new market is being constructed in phases, describing as unattainable suggestions by the traders is unfit for business.
We have employed more than necessary watchmen to take care of their goods. And talking of the fencing, you know, this is a project that is being funded by outsiders, donors, and the government itself. And you know, we have phases. This is the first phase. The fencing happens to be in the second phase. And you know, we're not saying once they move inside, it's going to be off. We are going to make sure the market gets to the level that they want. But it is a sequential process. It is a process that we need to follow. They need to move inside so that in case we make any proposal to the government or to any of the donors, they will see that, of course, the facility that we applied for, that they send money for us to build, it is being in use. Once the facility is in use, we can at least send a proposal talking about the fencing, talking about any other things that they've asked for. Right. So for the fencing, it is something that is in our and it is in the pipeline. That will be done very soon. Okay. But we need to move them inside. They need to go inside to start the trading before we can do that proposal, because it is in the second phase.
Nana Asensu Mensah reporting for Joy News.
Still watching Joy News today. We'll break for a few messages. Stay tuned in.